The ventilation shaft smelled of scorched ozone and ancient dust. Kaylin pressed her spine against the ribbed metal, holding her breath until her lungs burned. Below her, in the Sovereign's private war room, her uncle's voice was a low, methodical hum. "We detonate the charges during the opening summit," Sovereign Malachar said, his hand sweeping across a holographic projection of the station. "The evidence we plant will point directly to the Terran delegation's transport logs." They were finalizing the genocide of the only people who actually knew her name. What do you do when the empire you belong to decides to erase the only people who actually see you? For months earlier, the observation deck's glass had been freezing to the touch. Kaylin stood by the viewport. Dozens of Malachar officials brushed past her, their silk robes whispering against the polished floors. Not one looked her way. She was royalty in name only, a distant, inconvenient bloodline relegated to greeting duty at the edge of the sector. She was a ghost in her own house. Then the Terran transport docked. They were loud. They moved without the synchronized grace of the Malachar court, adjusting their gear and looking around with wide, unpolished curiosity. When Kaylin stepped forward to deliver the mandatory, centuries-old welcoming address, she expected them to walk right past her. Everyone always did. "Welcome to the Azure Summit," she recited, her voice perfectly flat. "May our stars align in." The lead Terran stopped. The entire procession piled up behind him. He was a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes and a jacket that looked practically woven by hand. He didn't nod and move on. He stopped entirely, reaching into his coat. The Kaylin security detail tensed. Their hands dropped toward their pulse weapons. The Terran pulled out a small, physical notebook made of bound paper. "I'm Elias," he said. He clicked a primitive ink pen. "What was your name? I want to make sure I pronounce it right." Kaylin blinked. She looked at the strange notebook, then up at his face. No one asked for her name. It was etched on the official manifest, certainly, but spoken aloud? Never. "Kaylin," she breathed. "Kaylin," Elias repeated. He carefully scratched the letters onto the fibrous page. "Thank you, Kaylin." That single moment fractured her reality. Weeks later, at the diplomatic gala, the room was a blur of high society posturing and political maneuvering. Kaylin stood in her usual corner, blending seamlessly into the metallic walls. She watched the Terrans from afar. They were so fragile compared to her people, yet so undeniably present. "You mentioned the temperature on the lower decks last time," a voice said. Kaylin jumped. Elias was standing next to her. He held out a paper cup fitted with a thin plastic lid. It was radiating heat. "Coda bean brew," Elias smiled. "Not quite as good as Earth coffee, but it helps the cold." Kaylin took the cup. The heat seeped into her palms, a stark contrast to the sterile chill of the station. It was a mundane object, disposable, completely unremarkable by royal standards. But to her, it felt like holding a dying star. She hadn't just been heard weeks ago. She had been remembered. Over the next few months, she found excuses to visit their quarters. She observed them doing things entirely alien to her people. They maintained crew logs. They taped physical photographs of their families to the bulkheads. They updated personal journals before they slept. They valued the individual life, celebrating the small, messy details of existence. The Malachar only valued the collective machine, and the machine was preparing to devour them, which brought her back to the cold metal of the ventilation shaft, clutching a datapad, listening to her bloodline plan a massacre. She gripped the stolen datapad tighter. The cold metal edges dug into her palms, a sharp physical sensation that grounded her racing mind. Her fingers danced across the glass interface, opening a direct, encrypted channel to Elias's outdated communication device. She compiled the raw audio logs from the room below, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She carefully attached the structural schematics and the falsified manifests of the planted evidence. To hit the transmission key meant erasing her own life. It meant severing her bloodline, accepting permanent exile, and becoming truly invisible to her own kind. The Empire weighed the worth of a life entirely by its societal category and rank. The Terrans weighed it by the individual. They had looked at her. They had asked for her name. As Kaylin presses herself against the shadows of the corridor, holding her breath while listening to her own family finalize the details for the genocide of the Terran race, what choice will she make? She tapped the screen. The data packet vanished into the station's massive network. She scrambled backward through the narrow ventilation shaft, her knees scraping against the rough grating. Dropping heavily into the lower maintenance tier, she sprinted toward the grand hall. The opening ceremony was already commencing. The air vibrated with the low thrum of thousands of delegates taking their seats. The plans she had overheard in that war room were reaching their absolute apex. Standing concealed at the edge of the grand hall, she watched Sovereign Malika step up to the central illuminated podium. He raised his hands expansively to welcome the assembly. He was waiting for the floor beneath the Terran sector to ignite. Nothing happened. The Terran seating blocks were completely empty. Not a single human remained in the sector. Before Malika could lower his hands, the massive crystalline displays suspended above the podium glitched. The station's network had been forcibly overridden by primitive, brute-force human algorithms. Malika's own voice, recorded just an hour prior in the sealed war room, flooded the cavernous chamber. Every syllable of the bombing plot, every detail of the framed transport logs, played in crisp, undeniable audio for 300 species to hear. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and terrifying. Then, chaos fractured the hall. Neutral security forces swarmed the dais, their weapons drawn not on the missing Terrans, but on the royal conspirators. The intricate political web of the sector dissolved in seconds. Malikar's eyes darted frantically across the room, finally locking onto Kaylin standing perfectly still by the exit archway. He understood immediately who had breached the network. He did not yell or fight the guards holding his arms. He simply pointed a trembling finger at her, his voice cutting through the panic to issue a formal, irrevocable decree of treason, stripping her titles and banishing her from Malakar space forever. The neutral spaceport of Oakhaven smelled of industrial chemical solvent, rusted exhaust ports, and unwashed bodies. Kaylin sat motionless against a curved transit wall, her knees pulled tight to her chest. 3 days had passed without sleep or food. The galaxy was violently reshaping itself around the summit scandal, and she was nothing but a discarded, titleless variable waiting for her final credits to run out. She watched the boots of passing travelers, entirely numb. A shadow fell over her. A distinct set of heavy, unpolished boots stopped directly at her feet. Elias reached down. His hand was rough, calloused, and overwhelmingly warm as he gripped her forearm and pulled her upright. The rest of his crew stood behind him, their expressions fierce and protective. They were offering her full asylum. Years later, the Azure Coast University auditorium was bright with natural sunlight. Kaylin stepped up to the wooden podium, looking down at the front row where Elias and his crew sat smiling. Resting on the corner of the lectern was a single object, an empty paper codebean cup with a plastic lid. It had survived the exile. Could an empty paper cup really be the sole visual anchor that pushes someone to betray an empire? Join us next time to find out.